Okay, this is going to be a quick piece on the Ukraine. So I can start with the really easy ones. It's a tragedy. People are dying. Shouldn't be dying. Economies are crumbling. Just the litany of things that we should have evolved past and haven't. That's what's going on. And my position basically is I want the world to be at peace. And I think it needs to. If it doesn't find a unified peace within the next 20, 30 years, then we will have war, fascism, environmental destruction baked in. And unfortunately this war is doing that. It's creating narratives which are simple, dualistic, and just setting the scene for more war, really. And I can't help but feel like I'm in a slight paradox. So you think if you love peace, you should just unconditionally say no to this war. No, Putin's bad, the whole thing's bad. But it's just so simplistic that. Being anti-war is not necessarily being pro-peace in this situation. And this is where I think is the crux of it. People need to be pro-peace, not just anti-war. And you know the key to being pro-peace is accepting that your adversary is human, rational, and has legitimate grievances. Now, the narrative is not that. The narrative is Putin is insane. He's a megalomaniac. He's a warmonger. Basically, you can't negotiate with him. This kind of narrative just leads to more war. It destroys the possibility for peace because it destroys the human in the opposing position. So it's very much right to condemn this war, but exactly when we're doing it, we should condemn ourselves for not actually having tried to achieve peace. And why didn't we? And when I say we, here it's the US really, and Europe is playing a little bit of second fiddle. But everything in the world now is involved with the US. It's an empire. It doesn't look like the Empire of Rome or Britain, but it is an empire. 100 years, 200 years from now, historians will say this was the time of the American Empire. And it has its fingers all over this. And it didn't want peace. It could have brokered a peace in Ukraine, and it refused. There was no negotiations, were there? Leading up to this utter tragedy, following the news, how many times did you hear the Minsk agreements mentioned? I didn't see them mentioned in the mainstream media once. I saw lots about war, lots about the coming of war, lots about the demonization of the Russians, or Putin in particular, but nothing about the fundamental basis for peace in Ukraine, which was the Minsk agreements. In fact, the only people mentioning the Minsk agreements were the Russians, who seemed quite set on them, really. And now this whole thing, there's so many lies on either side. So many lies. Is there genocide? Isn't there a genocide? I mean, I feel that all of it is smoke and mirrors. Really, you just need to cut through all of it and realise there is no moral international order. It doesn't exist. I've been looking for it for 20 years. It doesn't exist. There is no morality when it comes to international politics. If there was, then where are the sanctions on Israel, Saudi Arabia? Why is it that if the nation mostly contains Arabs, black people, then it doesn't have a sovereignty. Its people can't appeal to the International Criminal Court. The aggressors against these people will not suffer sanctions. Israel is occupying another nation's territory, forcefully removing its people and settling its land. That's further than Russia is going to go. Is Russia going to wipe out a city, move its own people in? Well, maybe, if you believe some of the media, maybe it will. Yeah, so there's no international moral order. I really wish there was. Really do wish there was, but there isn't. So you should just drop that and instead look at what there is, which is geopolitical power struggles. So all you can say with certainty when it comes to the Ukraine is it was neutral or pro-Russian pre-2014. After 2014, it wasn't neutral or pro-Russian. It was explicitly pro-West, pro the US here. And again, you can look into that and say, it was just an honest revolution, turned violent and overthrew a democratic government, and it's all the will of the people, and it's all very innocent. Or you go the other way and be like, America funded a bunch of neo-Nazis to topple the government and install, pro-Western politicians. But you don't need either story. The reality is, the government was either neutral or pro-Russian, then it became Western. And as soon as that happened, Russia was faced with a dilemma. Dilemma one, it needed to maintain Crimea, where its navy had been for over 100 years. And Russia was still there, it was just renting it off the Ukrainians. So it had to seize it. And you can say it held a perfectly reasonable referendum in the Crimea and they voted to leave the Ukraine, or you can say they were held at gunpoint and the Russians just annexed it. Again, it's kind of irrelevant. The relevance is the geopolitical, strategic nature of the Crimea and the naval base at Sevastopol and the trade routes to the Mediterranean is vital for the state of Russia. It wasn't going to lose them, so it acted. Just like any other country would act. The second dilemma was that Ukraine was going to join NATO, and NATO isn't a defensive pact. When was any NATO country attacked and NATO was actually used as a defensive pact? No. When did NATO countries launch multiple wars against, again, mostly people in the Middle East? Multiple times in the last 20 years. It's an aggressive military alliance, which allows the US to park its nuclear weapons and its other strike weaponry in your country. So Russia was like, we don't want that. Ukraine's a big country. It could become a very powerful military country, stocked with American weaponry, nuclear missiles, so close to Moscow with the hypersonic technology that the Russians would probably have to automate their missile defense system. Their nuclear retaliation would be automated. Who the fuck wants that? Who wants the total destruction of the world based on a computer algorithm? Nobody. So from what I saw, that was Russia's position. Fine, you've got Ukraine culturally, economically, but back off militarily and we keep the Crimea. And if anyone had a sense of reason and balance, then they would have accepted that. They would have said, fine, keep your strategic interests, keep the guns down, Ukraine is fine, just economically tying in with the West. Why didn't people argue for that? Why wasn't that just repeated again and again in the lead up to this war? Why didn't all the news stations be like, the Minsk Agreement, let's talk about it, let's debate it? Why was there no debates on the TV? Why was there no fucking debates amongst the diplomats? And in fact, when these diplomats meet, why isn't that live? something like this, it affects the whole world. So why aren't those debates live when, the Russian foreign minister and the American foreign ministers meet? What could they possibly say that we wouldn't be allowed to hear? When Russia says, could you please not park NATO forces in a neighbouring country? What is the American answer that we're not allowed to hear? Do you know why I think we don't hear these kind of talks? Because it would show the total fucking lie that is the entire international moral order. The total lie that we are so happy to lap up whenever it's fed to us. But we don't actually care for peace. We're not willing to make the hard decisions for peace. We're not willing to accept that Russia has interests, it has fears. We would just stick to some kind of crazy absolutes like the sovereignty of a nation, of course, until it doesn't suit our strategic interests, and then the sovereignty of nations goes out the window. Or we'll say how horrific it is when white people are getting killed in the Ukraine, but it's not a problem if they're brown people. It's just not a problem. And you can say, it is a problem, and then you can look at the actual results, the sanctions, and things like this, and they just don't happen. I mean, if Britain was going to start sending anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Hamas, then it's okay. Now there's a moral order. They're sending them to fight the Russians. They're sending them to fight the Israelis. We're good. We're for the sovereign nations. It's bollocks. And we're just getting played. We're just getting played every time. And in this situation, the Ukrainian people are getting slaughtered for this little geopolitical game of chess. Because we could have had peace. If the US and Russia had just accepted certain realities, there could have been peace. But I think the US basically said, if you accept the peace we're offering, you become encircled, you lose your bases in the Crimea, you lose your access to the Mediterranean, you become vastly diminished. That's what happens if you accept our peace. And if you go to war, this is what happens. You become completely isolated financially. You become a power on the world stage. You will not claim the Ukraine. You will destroy it, and its people will hate you forever. So it was like win-win. Why should we broker a different kind of peace? A peace that avoids war. A peace that kind of gives something to the Russians for what they have lost. This is why people should look at the world. This is why the Chinese are looking at the world. They're like, oh, so we condemn Russia? Or can we see that they are being backed into a corner just like we're going to get backed into a corner one day? And if we support Russia now, then we have an ally. Because there's no way the West is going to ally with China. Because the West sees China as a threat. Doesn't see it as a legitimate nation going about its business and economically growing and blah blah blah. It sees it as a direct threat, and one day it will fight it. Yeah. But we just keep living in this dream world that there's good people and bad people. It's so easy like that, isn't it? And of course we're always the good people. If people really are against war, then they need to be for peace. And for that to happen, you need empathy, you need understanding. You need to make sacrifices so the other person can live with the peace that is on offer. That didn't happen. And it's not going to happen. We are facing a future now of militarism and war. I personally don't think there's any way back, really. We are all too wedded to animal logic. Yeah, anyway, that was my take on it.